Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Roger, and thank you for asking me to come and do this talk. I said no, first of all, because it's a bit scary. I haven't done an audience like this ever. Yeah, amazing. Who would believe that many years ago, well, early 50s, when I first went to a National Honey Show at the Royal Horticultural Hall in London, that I would finish up doing a talk at the National Honey Show here. But not only that, following my hero, Tom Seeley. I can't believe that. So when did this all start? Well, 70 years. It is a long time, and I will probably find it impossible to keep in an hour, but I'll do my best. I didn't get a very auspicious start in life. Well, say from around about 7 years old, my parents had an acrimonious split. My grandfather died, and World War II started. So that wasn't a particularly, pleasant time. I did my 11 plus twice and failed twice. So I was due to leave school at 14, but no idea what I wanted to do. My father suggested, as I was good at technical drawing, to look for an apprenticeship as a draftsman, but there were no vacancies. So I finished up going back to school for a while, which I was very disappointed about because I hated school. And then one day my father was reading our local newspaper, the Luton News, and he looked up and said, "There's a job here that may suit you." It's at a research station, agricultural research station at Harpenden, which was about 8 miles away from where we lived, for an assistant or something. Yeah, okay. He prodded me into applying for this job. I had an interview, which lasted about 5 or 10 minutes, I think, and that was with Dr. Collin Butler, the head of the bee department, and a Miss Singh. And he offered me a job, starting at when can you start? So I started the following Monday, and £1 a week. And I was taken up to the home apiary. I had no idea what an apiary was. I was given a piece of net over a hat, and I was handed a smoking canister with a bellows attached, and I was led out into the apiary, and I was told to blow some smoke in this slot in the front of these boxes. And Norman Element, the head apiarist, took the top off, and I was absolutely petrified. I had never seen anything like this before. And but slowly I became interested in what was going on, in there. I became fascinated by it by the time we'd looked at 2 or 3 hives. And like most of you got hooked, I was hooked straight away. Within half an hour, I was hooked on bees and have been ever since and still am. So that was how I started. So let's have a look at some pictures. I read an article a few years ago about making a presentation, and it said that your first slide should capture and hold the attention of the audience. So, does that work? You think that works? Well, what's the connection? Well, there is a connection. There's quite a strong connection, certainly with bees at Rothamsted, because a few years ago, a colleague at Rothamsted, Dr. Peter Kennedy, emailed me, this was after I retired, obviously, and said that he'd found this record of this chap, Lieutenant DMT Morland, capturing 18 Germans at Givenchy in the last days of the Battle of Festenberg on the 25th of May 1915. Could that be the same Morland that worked at Rothamsted? In fact, was the first research scientist on bees at Rothamsted. And I said, well, his name was Dennis Max Thompson Morland, and I'd heard of him referred to as the Mad Major Morland. So I said, yeah, it's got to be the same person, and of course it is. It was the same person. And here he is. He got his MC for that. He collected his medal when he was home on leave one day, and he was married on the same day. And he used to joke afterwards, 2 crosses in one day. But I need to tell you something about Rothamsted. I don't know how many of you know of Rothamsted or know anything about it at all, but Rothamsted was the Rothamsted Experimental Station. It's now Rothamsted Research, and it was founded by John Bennett Laws here. He was born in the manor in 1814, and he inherited the estate when he was 8 years old from his father. He came down from Oxford without a degree, which was not uncommon in those days, just to give up on it. And but he became very interested in the farm and crop production. And he started experimenting to see if he could do anything to improve crop production, which is really the whole basis of Rothamsted to this day. And he did some experiments up in his bedroom here, much to the chagrin of his mother, and he was eventually cast out into a barn on the estate. But what he did anyway, he went on to develop superphosphate, which is basically, it's a mixture of ground up bones and sulfuric acid. And this became very popular. He went on to build a factory at Deptford, where he produced this superphosphate, and 2 other factories on the Thames. So he did quite well out of it. In 1843, which is the date that is marked down as the foundation of Rothamsted, he appointed Joseph Henry Gilbert, a chemist. Most of the time, Gilbert ran the whole thing, and Law spent a lot of time in London and down in Devon. But they struck up a partnership which lasted for 57 years. It's believed that it's the longest research partnership that there's ever been. He went on to, in 1855, they completed this testimonial laboratory, the first laboratory on the left there, and then the central laboratory, which was started in 1914 and for obvious reasons was not completed until 1918. And then in later years, that was incorporated into the main building. I've always called this the main building. All these buildings have been given names of directors, and I have never been able to get used to that. So they're still to me main building, north building, west building, so on. And that is still as it looks today. Eventually it became, the whole top floor became the library. It was a magnificent library, but of course since digitalisation, you know, the library has shrunk so much, it's just gone in a much smaller building, and nowhere near as nice and pleasant to work in as that. So bees, the first mention of bees was here. I don't know if you can read it, but from the diary of Robert Witterong the Younger, who was the lord of the manor, he lived from 1693 to 1728, and this was in the summer of 1725. He wrote, has been the wettest that any man can remember. My wife was forced to feed her bees in June, familiar, or they would have been starved, the weather being so wet every day that they could not get out to gather any honey. I used this in an exhibit once, and I put some things never change, because that does still happen, doesn't it, occasionally. So this painting was done by John Laws's wife. Forgotten the name of his wife now. Never mind. Charlotte, I think. Yeah. Anyway, so that was the first mention of bees, and it was 200 years before bees were mentioned again. And that was here in the Rothamsted Annual Report, 1921-22. The circumstances that Dr. Imms, and Dr. Imms was the head of was then called the entomological department, was interested in bees, led to the Ministry of Agriculture to suggest that the entomological department should undertake the study of bees as honey producers, leaving bee diseases to be studied at Aberdeen as at present. Mr. D.M.T. Morland was appointed to be in charge of the work, and he will, at an early date, proceed to the United States to study the methods in use there. In the meantime, 2 minor problems of practical importance are being investigated: the suitability of metal combs in place of those naturally built, and the situation of the frames in relation to the hive front. A field laboratory has been erected and is now in working order. Well, that's the field laboratory. How this came about was this was it was something that was started at Cambridge in 1919, a 3-year project that was funded partly by the BBKA, and then in 22 it was moved to Rothamsted. That is just the bees and the equipment. No people came, but just the bees and the equipment, and this little hut was built, and that's where I started work in that hut. And it referred in that to the metal combs. Well, I rescued this one from a skip. It was being lost. It's now in the Rothamsted archive. But I don't know whether you can read the small print there. I don't know whether I can read the small print there. Let me read you about, because it's quite interesting. This is a drawn-out comb of hexagonal cells, exactly as bees build in their natural state. It's wax, coated with wax, yeah, and has been thoroughly tested and is not an experiment. Bees readily take to it for rearing brood and storing honey. Strong and durable, will last 50 years with care. Big consumption of honey saved to produce wax for comb building. Control of bee diseases. No more burning of combs, each comb easily sterilised and used over again. The money comb. Well, Morland looked at that and found it was useless. The bees didn't like it. When it was placed in amongst other combs, it tended to absorb the heat from other combs, and the bees sort of deserted the other combs that were against it, and it discouraged them from building comb there. And if you look at it closely, it says it's like, you know, the bees build, but the cells are the wrong way up. Yeah. Oh, the other problem, that he looked at was what we know as the cold or warm way, and he found absolutely no difference in the cold or warm way on the development of the colony, honey produced or whatever, or brood. Yeah, we still argue about that, don't we? Yeah. So here's Morland in the weighing hut. Morland was involved in quite a few things. He compared temperature, maintenance, ventilation and condensation in single-walled, double-walled and packed hives, still going on today. Showed no difference in the effectiveness of cane or beet sugar for winter feed. That was one that was in one of the journals just a few weeks ago. Investigated many honey production problems, such as frosting by granulated honey, thixotropy of heather honey, and the effects of adding acid to boiling sucrose to invert it before feeding. He initiated studies into the cause of swarming, particularly studying the brood food theory, and this subject, of course, was to continue at Rothamsted for many years afterwards. Morland's in the weighing hut here. Now, when I started at Rothamsted, one of my jobs, and the weighing hives were still going on then, we're talking now, we're in now to the 40s, and my job every Saturday morning, we used to work 5.5 days a week then, was to weigh the hives, change the charts. There was a chart, you know, on a cylinder that revolved and a pen that marked loss and gain of weight. And in that hut was a piece of apparatus that sort of fascinated me then as a young boy, and it was like an endless belt, and it had got 2-pound lead weights on it, spaced out about 3 inches apart, and it was connected to a motor, and the motor, the switch of the motor was connected to the arm that the pen was on. So the problem was, you see, that like at weekends, if there was a heavy honey flow on, the needle would go off, the pen would go off the top of the chart. So you didn't know what was happening then. So what happened was, when the needle got, the pen got close to the top of the chart, it would switch on the motor, the belt would turn, and one of these weights would drop on the pan. So you knew when this happened, because you get a straight line, you know, coming down, and you could mark plus 2 pounds, you see. But I was fascinated by that, and it turned out that, talking about it one day to somebody, I can't remember who, it turned out that it was made by a chap called Fabergé. Yeah? Yeah. It's only in recent years that I've looked into that, and I found that this was Alexander Fabergé, who was the grandson of the great man, Carl Fabergé, the famous jeweller. Yeah, when they left Russia, his family finished up in France, and he was sent here to get an education. He stayed here, and he joined the army at the start of the war. And for some reason, he was designated to Rothamsted, to the bee department, to study pollination. I don't know. I don't know. Anyway, the thing is, quickly, about Fabergé, is a fascinating character. He became a British citizen, but then he emigrated to America at the end of the war, and he made a big name for himself in genetics. And he published, in 50 years, he published nearly 70 scientific papers, most of them on genetics, but a lot on other things. And also, in the list of papers, there's one. He was at Rothamsted for a very short time. I mean, we're talking about a year or so. He published a paper while he was there on a device for counting bees leaving and returning to the hive. But, yeah, apparently he used to argue with himself in 3 different languages. He's obviously, you know, a brilliant eccentric. Yeah. So regular conferences were held at Rothamsted in these years, the 30s and 40s. I'm not so sure how many in the 40s, but and this one is quite interesting because it's now got Harry Tarr here. Harry Tarr was appointed to work on diseases, and here's Moreland in the middle. These are a couple of visiting. Obviously, these are speakers at the conference. This is Megan Tyler from Switzerland, and Morris, a guy called Morris. Yeah, Morris from Scotland. And I don't know whether any of you recognise this fella here. I'm sure some of you do. William Herod Hempsall. You've heard of William Herod Hempsall. I mean, William Herod Hempsall in the 20s and 30s was the most famous beekeeper in Britain. I mean, there's 2 volumes of his huge book, you know, beekeeping, described with pen and camera. His operation was in Luton. He had a big apiary there. I mean, he had over 120 colonies in one apiary on the edge of Luton. That's excluding his mating nukes. Anyway, here's another conference. We moved on a bit now, and Collin Butler here had taken over from Moreland as head of bees. Morgan Tyler's still here, look. This is P.S. Milne, Philip Milne, who took over from Tarr on the bee disease side. And in 1944, the bee department gained its autonomy, separated from the entomology department, and Butler was obviously head of that. Milne carried on for a while until they brought in the bee disease order, which I think was 1944, somewhere around there, and the number of samples that they were coming in was just overwhelming. And it was sort of preventing Butler and the rest of them from doing much bee research, you know. So eventually it was separated to the ministry, MAF as it then was, and Milne became head of that. There was a building built opposite Rothamsted Lodge, which I'll mention in a minute, for this department, bee disease department, but Philip Milne refused to go over there. He wanted to stay working close to Butler, so he knew what was going on. And you're probably familiar with the other character here. Brother Adam? Yeah, Brother Adam. Yeah, Brother Adam got quite close association with Butler. Yeah, we used to get a lot of queens from Brother Adam at one time. Dead queens. Okay, let's move on. So, 1940s. Well, some years ago, Norman Carrick had a brown envelope handed to him at a National Honey Show, and it contained 60 photographs that were taken during the war by an official ministry photographer. They're really good photographs, and these are a few of those. It's a really good record, and again, I don't know why they would send a ministry photographer just to take the pictures of the home apiary. I don't know, but they did. And here's Arthur Rolt was still there. This is John Clifford, whose place I took when he went off to do national service. and a couple of girls marking bees at the entrance. Of course, this is a technique, you know, still used today. And the weighing hut at the bottom here. Norman Element. Norman Element took over from the head apiarist, Arthur Rolt, in early 1946. Norman Element became really the backbone of bee research at Rothamsted for about 25 years. He'd got a lot of beekeeping experience. He passed his proficiency certificate when he was 18. By 23, he was the disease officer for Middlesex and the beekeeping expert for Pinner district, where he lived. Norman Element taught me an awful lot. He was an excellent beekeeper. He was a very adventurous beekeeper and a very up-to-date beekeeper, always looking for new ways of doing things. But he was a master craftsman as well. He could do anything from put inlay on an antique furniture or put a roof on a house. He was that good. And the first thing that Norman did was went through everything and standardised everything. He did away with shallow supers. He did away with queen excluders because they weren't interested in honey. They were just interested in bees and brood. You can see here, look, all deep boxes. And this was one of his things. He got fed up with lifting a feeder off the top of a hive when he was doing queen rearing, so he built a feeders, with these boxes, he built a feeder on the side so he could fill the feeder from the outside without lifting the roof off even. Yeah, that was Norman Element. He even, when he was in the RAF, he even kept bees on his RAF station and held lessons in beekeeping at his RAF station. Yeah. In the winter of 1946-47, the bee department came together and moved into Rothamsted Lodge. This was the dower house of the estate. 1946-47 was a terrible winter. It was, I don't care what anybody says, it was the worst winter ever. The temperature dropped to 20 degrees below in Luton. It snowed everywhere in the country every day for a month, and there was a 4 or 5 week spell when the temperature didn't go above freezing night or day. It was just horrendous. And then you had smog on top of that. But we survived that. And yeah, Rothamsted Lodge. And there's a picture here of 3 of the scientists of the bee department, James Simpson, Ronald Ribbons and Collin Butler. You may have heard of Ronald Ribbons' book, Behaviour, can I remember that? The Behaviour and Something of Honeybees. It was recommended reading by the BBKA, you know, for exams right up until just a few years ago. Ribbons was there for a few years, but left to take up a post at Cambridge and was sadly killed in a road accident not long afterwards. Ribbons was one of the new breed of scientists. You know, he'd been through the war, different approach altogether, and him and Butler were like chalk and cheese, you know, and they didn't get on, but Ribbons was a great chap. There we go. The best die young. Right, okay, well, we switch things a bit here. I was okay and quite sort of, you know, reasonably happy. I was happy doing the beekeeping at Rothamsted and jogging along, not looking to change anything. And then one day, my father and I were listening to Down Your Way. Do you remember Down Your Way? And they were visiting this village in Cornwall called Golville, about a mile outside Penzance. And they were talking about this guy, Colonel Gare, was setting up this business of making mead commercially and about keeping all these bee colonies around Penzance. And my father said, that sounds an interesting place to work. You know, that sounds an interesting job. Oh, well. Anyway, the upshot was that he persuaded me to write off and see if they got any jobs. I know it's hard to believe, but that's how fathers and sons were in those days a bit. And an interview was arranged. I had an interview with a Mrs. Mann, who was the manageress of the Mead House, Mead Makers, and in the Paddington Hotel in London. I was offered a job on the spot, And the next thing I knew, I was on the Cornish Riviera Express heading for Penzance. I mean, it was 300 miles. I thought it would never end. I'd never been, further than Southend, and it was just unbelievable. So that was it. I arrived at. I was met by this friendly Cornish cobbler who was the husband of my landlady for the next 3.5 years, This was the Mead House here, you can see in the middle there. It was a flour mill here, huge building with 2-foot solid granite walls. All this is part of it as well here. These were offices in the end, when we were there. Here's a plan of it. The only trouble, our trouble was that the extracting room and syrup making room was up here. So there's a winch here, a hand winch. So we had to winch all our supers up there and then lower syrup down on a rope. But it was all good fun, as a young boy. I mean, it was terrific, winding up these. We used to lay a rope loop on the floor, stack the supers on, loop it through. Then it would go health and safety. 2 of us would lean out of one of the doors at the end and pull this in. On one occasion, we pulled in the rope without the supers in. I'll leave that to your imagination. Yeah, and the mead, the floors were numbered from top to bottom because the mead was decanted down, through the floors. Right. So that's me when I arrived, or not long afterwards, in Cornwall. And this apiary site, Colonel Gilbert got about 20 colonies of his own, but he brought up colonies from all over the place. So they were in all different sorts of equipment. You can see some Daytons there. And this apiary site, where he dumped them all down, there were about over 100 colonies there, was at Murals. I don't know if any of you know Cornwall, but that's right opposite St Michael's Mount and Mounts Bay. So can you imagine that, beekeeping there, looking out St Michael's Mount and Mounts Bay. I thought it was great. It was wonderful. We gradually extended, moved these colonies out and extended around the peninsula. And we had them at places like St Just and Zena and places like that, but they were on the coast, and they proved pretty poor apiary sites. So gradually we moved further east and further inland. And we used to keep about 20 colonies in each apiary. And to start off with, we had, I think we did for most of the time, we had, each apiary was a different sort of hive, but at least it was the whole apiary. When I arrived, there was a guy in charge of the bees, but he left shortly afterwards. And this chap, Arthur Cutter, Cornish lad, he was only 22 then, and he was put in charge. He knew nothing about bees. John Porter here in the middle, he was a Bedfordshire lad as well. He lived in Dunstable, and he came down. He got some experience. He had 2 hives of his own for a couple of years. So, and the other guy was, we had different people working with us over the time I was there, and it was an interesting chap. Bill Venn, his name. He was a Cornish man. He was born on the Isles of Scilly. I nearly said Scilly Isles. You mustn't say Scilly Isles. The Isles of Scilly. And he was a taxi driver, and he was an ambulance driver in the First World War. He got masses of interesting stories. I learned a lot from him. So that was us, novices really, looking after 300 colonies of bees in the end. Great. But I had a wonderful time. Here we are extracting honey. We never did wear white coats. Out the back of the Mead Hall, there was this ornate garden that Gilbert had built, and everything that was done there was made in-house. He had carpenters and bricklayers and tinsmiths and goodness knows what. Even the stained glass windows there. This became the Mead Hall, where Gilbert used to hold these ceremonies and drink lots of mead. And there was a museum apiary there as well. Here we are, travelling around. I mean, it was amazing. It was wonderful. I had a marvellous time. And 1949 was one of the best summers ever John Porter and I used to go swimming in the sea nearly every day from April till October. It was absolutely amazing. And we used to go round and work away at the bees as quickly as we could, you know, perhaps finish about 3 o'clock and then head off to the nearest beach. Because we had to clock in and out, so there was no point in going back, you know. So we used to arrange it so we got back about 5 minutes before clocking on time. You may have noticed these hives, long hives. Yeah, they're the Gilbert hive, there we are, 21 Dayton Frames. You know, I mean, it's still going on today, isn't it? People want to design their own hive, you know, everybody's got to have their own hive. And Colonel Gare was the same, he wanted his own hive, so he designed this one. The Gare, the long modified Dayton Gilbert hive, that's it, yeah. 21 combs. It had got vertical excluders to start off with, because 7 Dayton frames is equal to a standard brood chamber. But we found that they stuck the excluders to the combs and they became sort of barriers. So we threw those out and then they worked pretty well. But of course, commercially, they were a bit of a bugbear because you mentioned getting honey off of those. But can you imagine 40 of those Dayton deeps full of honey spinning around in an extractor? That amount of honey you get out, you know, in one go. We got massive colonies in those. We had a lot of good colonies in those, and they tended to build in the middle. They tended to build or rear brood from top to bottom, side to side. I remember we had up to 14 brood on up to 14 combs. You know, Daytons, big colonies, and I came to the conclusion that big hives didn't necessarily stop swarming. You just got bigger swarms. I think, yeah, okay. Now, Gare was one for free publicity, so he thought up this idea of on St Bartholomew's Day, 24th of August, the day I got married, he would have this ceremony of blessing the mead. So I'm one of the fanfare trumpeters there on the right. So we had a bit of a ceremony in the local church, and then we traipsed down the road to the Mead House, and here we are, finished off the ceremony there. This is me here. Yeah, there. Yeah. John Porter, who carried the mazer of mead, he was a bit annoyed because he's obscured behind this guy. He's directly behind that guy. But it's this chap here I like. He seemed to think, oh dear, what is going on? I returned, I went off to do national service and it all folded up. I don't know whether that was any connection with those two things, but yeah, it all went pear-shaped soon afterwards. And I went back some years later, and this was the mill looking very sorry for itself and derelict. And then 10 years after that, I went back again and it had gone. And there's these cottages there now, but they are called the Mead Houses, which I thought was quite nice. But where did all that granite go? I mean, a massive building, 2 foot thick walls of granite. I couldn't find out. I asked around, but nobody seemed to know, unless it was used as like breakers maybe on the front, because they used to do that. But yeah, that's a part of the original wall there. So that was Mead Makers. But there's also, in the National Honey Show, a little mazer here on the left for dry mead. Yeah, I think with the mead, what happened was that Gare sort of overstretched himself. He went for a variety of meads. Probably, I think there were about 9. You know, like Hippocras, Melomel, Piment, Sac-metheglin, metheglin. You know, well, people, if they go in and ask for a glass of mead, what they got was mead, and mead was quite a sort of insipid and not particularly nice drink. So they thought, oh, we don't like this. But I think if he'd have gone for something, you know, a bit different, he would have had more success. Anyway, yeah, so that was Mead Makers. And then I went off and did national service, and after national service, or before I finished my national service, I met my wife-to-be, and I wanted to come back to that area, Harpenden. She lived in St Albans, and my father by then lived in St Albans. So I wrote back to Rothamsted and asked if there were any vacancies. I wanted to work in the sort of apiary section, but there were no vacancies. But Collin Butler had just started his work on queen substance, as he called it, the queen pheromone, and he wanted another junior assistant. So he offered me the job. So I said, well, I'll take the job if, when there's a vacancy in the apiary, I can transfer. But as it turned out, I spent 14 years with him. I was working with a great chap. This chap here was his senior assistant, Ron Welch. And we got on so well, and he was such a nice bloke. And the work was so much more interesting than, you know, monotonous apiary work, to tell the truth. It was, yeah, so fascinating and interesting. I'd like to go through these people for you. How are we doing? Oh, crikey, look at the time. Phew, you're going to be here till 8 o'clock. Okay, let's rattle through the people. I don't know whether I need to point them out to you, but perhaps I should. Because it gives you an idea, you know, of what went on. In fact, I mean, the bee department, this is 1956, this picture was taken, so I'd been back there a couple of years then, and it had entered a long period, stable period of, you know, production of work, and a very stable period, probably about, let's say, about 25 or 30 years. I'll go through, yeah, John Free, you may have heard of these. I keep forgetting, you know, that it's like another generation, but there we are. But as I say, they went on for, you know, 30 years or so and longer. Yeah, this is John Free here. John Free took his PhD on bumblebees in the department and then got a permanent job. He went into pollination work, which he established as a major scientific discipline. And he showed the importance of pollination in 40 or 50 different crops. And then he went on to work on pheromones, the footprint odour, which is a pheromone, and of course the swarm lure, you know, which they went on to produce the swarm lure. With Ingrid Williams, Professor now Ingrid Williams, who worked with him, she was looking at new crops eventually, and Andrew Ferguson, who went on to pheromones. But in the 1980s, pheromone work came to a complete stop. Collin Butler himself, here in the middle, he'd worked on pollination and behaviour, and then he obviously went on to the queen substance, which, I mean, that work went on for, well, 14 years at least, and probably longer. It's funny because Norman Element, the head apiarist, was very, very friendly with ribbons. And Norman Element always contended that it was ribbons that gave Butler the idea that there was such a thing as queen substance, queen pheromone, because they stood observing an empty cage on a hive roof which had held a queen, but bees were still paying attention to it. And Ribbon said to Butler, this is Norman Element's story, there must be something left behind. And Butler thought, hey, yeah, so as I say, you know, 15 years later, that was Norman's story anyway. And with the queen pheromone was only the second insect pheromone to be discovered. The other one was of a silk moth. And then Butler got a lot of help from Kenneth Callow, who was a chemist who worked at the National Institute of Medical Research, but eventually transferred to Rothamsted. So who else we got? James Simpson. And of course, Bill Bailey. You must have heard of Bill Bailey here. Bailey first worked on Nosema and Acarin, and then on to the foul broods. And then when Rothamsted got one of the first, their first electron microscope, he turned his attention to viruses. And he isolated the first two insect viruses. That was chronic paralysis virus and acute paralysis virus. And then with Brenda Ball, over the next 10 years, they identified a further 9 viruses. There we are. I think that's it. The rest of the people here are apiary assistants, Bailey's assistant, Simpson's assistant here, a secretary, and a couple of girls. I only heard, I'm getting a bit worried actually because Bailey died in May this year and Butler died in January last year, and I only heard last week, I went to a Harpenden historical group meeting and I learned that this guy died last week. So I may be the only one still standing, I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, let's crack on. Okay. Yeah, 1956 was quite a significant year for me because I got my first bees, and these were my first 2 hives. I was a disciple of Manley, R.O.B. Manley. The first practical book I ever read was Honey Farming, and of course he got Dayton, so it had to be Dayton's. And I made my first hive. My wife and I went to an evening classes. They were, you might remember, they were very popular in those days. And I made a beehive, and my wife made an ironing board. I know, sign of the times, yeah. Perhaps I shouldn't say that. Is that not politically correct? Yeah, anyway. Really, I mean, that really tells the story of our life for the probably the 15 years after that, you know. There we go. Yeah, so by this time, the bee department was well established at Rothamsted Lodge. There was this new apiary building, and we had over about 300 colonies in 20 apiaries in a 80-mile radius around Harpenden, and a well-equipped honey house. The sharp-eyed amongst you probably noticed that they're not deep combs we're extracting from. That's because they're my combs. We were allowed, if we had our own bees, we were allowed to extract our honey in the honey house. What a blessing that was. Yeah. I mean, that came about because Butler had his own bees in those early days, and he hadn't got anywhere to extract his honey, so we extracted his honey in the honey house, so he couldn't refuse anybody else doing it either. I mean, when you look back at that, you know, that earlier picture, there was a terrific amount of practical knowledge. I mean, Ron Welch, who I worked with, he'd worked with Brother Adam. Tony Griffin, who was an apiary assistant, he was a part-time bee expert for Bedfordshire. Norman Element at one time was running 80 colonies of his own. You know, there was a terrific wealth. Ron Welch got bees. There was a terrific wealth of practical experience. So there was a lot of exchange of ideas and things, you know, between the scientists and us beekeepers. It was quite a really good setup. Yeah, and pollen traps there, a new batch of pollen traps, which were very important research tools at the time. So, queen substance, yeah, the queen. It's about this time, like, I like to think I made my big contribution to bee research. Butler wanted to design a bioassay, you know, so that he could test and find out what part of the queen, this queen substance was coming on from maybe, what it could do, what it would do. And he wanted to try and get queenless bees to start rearing cells in cages. So we collected up odd cages from around the department, and they were given a feeder with queen cage candy in, you know, that's honey and icing sugar, and distilled water in the top, and a little piece of comb on one of these tags. We put in 150 bees or thereabouts. We had a measure, you know. Put 150 bees in the morning. After 4 o'clock, we grafted 6 larvae into each cage, and then we checked them the next morning to see whether cells had started. And half of them they had, and roughly about half of them they hadn't. And so Butler said, well, that's no good, you know, we want 100% in the controls, it hasn't worked. So it's my job to take them out and empty them. So I thought, well, there must be a reason for this, you know, why has this happened? So I sorted them out into those that had and those that hadn't, And then it became obvious. Those that hadn't, these were odd cages that had been collected from the department, those that hadn't had got a much smaller feed hole. And obviously the restriction of the number of bees that could get to the food had affected the result. So I went back and told Ron Welch, and he told Butler, and Butler got Norman Element, the apiarist, to make us some plastic cages like this, 12 cages. We did it again, and bingo, every one started queen cells. So that was his bioassay. So from then on, every week, well, we had another load of cages made. We had 72 cages, and then every week for the next 4 years, twice a week, we set up 72 of these cages. Sometimes I wish I hadn't mentioned it, because these had to be washed, you know, thoroughly every time and then set up. It was like a whole week's job, sending it up, washing the cage, blah, blah. Yeah, so then he, you know, tested queens, extracts of parts of queens, and of course found, you know, that it was in the mandibular glands in the head, and then it was with the help of Callow, they found out, you know, some of the component parts, because they're still finding, I think they're still finding, but we found 902, I can never say it, oxidolic acid, something like that. We called it, from then on, we called it 902, but of course now it's 90, on and on. Yeah, so that was the discovery of queen substance. And there's Ron filling up the cages, or emptying the cages. Okay, and then we went on to look at drone flight, you know, because we got this lure thing, this queen substance. Eventually it's got synthesized, so we got artificial queen substance. And we flew the first one out on the lawn at Rothamsted Lodge, so about half the big of this room. And we got, I mean, there were a lot of colonies up there, so, but we got this massive comet formed. Everybody came out of the building to have a look. It was so exciting. I found it amazing. It was really, really exciting. And, you know, they were coming up to the lure, and then they were dropping away, going round and on, coming back and up again. And we noticed that they were chasing anything. So they would like chase a butterfly, a sparrow, a tennis ball thrown in the air, and a Wellington boot. Because they were just going for that outline against the sky, you see. They could see something and they were after it. Because, I mean, you know, when they got a bit nearer, they were like, no, this is not a queen. Yeah. And then we did some vertical stuff up this tower, 110-foot tower, and, you know, to see how many drones we could get at different heights, which was fairly... I don't think much of this was written up. We did an awful lot of this. In 1992, the bee department moved out the lodge when Butler took over as head of entomology department, so his section was lost to bee research. We took over the whole of the apiary building, and I built this observation hive room. There were 8 points for observation hives. I don't think I've got time to talk about them, but we made these with the little panels so that we could, you know, they could take out a panel and pick a bee out or mark a bee or whatever. Honey production with my bees has been pretty rubbishy, so I then started going over to pollination with my own. This is one of the few beehives that I've ever made. I scrounged most of them. I'm knocking on a bit now because we're getting close. Yeah, we had a big problem with foul brood in the 1960s, and we actually burnt 70 colonies. Bailey immediately introduced a hygiene regime so that bees were restricted in movement. We divided them up into 3 lots, east and west and the home apiary, and we weren't allowed to transfer stuff except into the home apiary, and then it wasn't out again. We had a dirty hut, so anything that came in contact with bees was put in there and dealt with in the winter. Those things really improved things, and we never really had a serious problem after that with disease. Until Varroa arrived, of course. So, yeah, we had at one time, my assistant and I, we decided to have a little museum apiary, and this was a Stewart Knife, which Butler had got a couple of original lifts of this, and we based that on those. This became one of the most photographed things, if not in the bee department, in the whole of Rothamsted. It was very popular. But it was a bit of a job to get bees into it, as you can see. These murals appeared in the new entomology building in the 1970s. Here's Laws and Gilbert on the left, the manor, and some skeps, so bees evident. The middle one, there's Rothamsted Lodge at the top with some beehives, and then the one at the end, late 50s, no bees at all. And you wondered, well, so is this an omen? And of course it proved it was. There we are. And of course the next challenge was Sea Grape. When Sea Grape arrived with the Rothamsted bees, this cut our sugar bill by 75%. It was quite amazing. I mean, we regularly fed colonies in June, and we always had to feed increase when we took off nukes early in the year. But that all stopped with Sea Grape. And I had a real serious back problem in 1976, and my wife, who had never been interested before, said, the sheriff's suits had just come out, get me a sheriff's suit and I'll come and help you. And that she did, and of course she got hooked on bees as well. And here are our bees now. Daytons have gone, they're Smiths now, and it's too long a story to go into that. But you may see that the hive stands are similar to the Rothamsted ones. That's because these came from Norman Element, and when he was making hive stands for Rothamsted, he made a whole big batch for himself, and then they came down to me. And then another mural appeared after the new centenary building was made at the bottom, and bees are back in vogue. You see the bee here on the flower? That's got a little transponder on its back. I don't know whether you can see that, but here we are, the radar work. You may have heard of this. Tracking bees. This works by sending out a beam which hits the transponder and then comes back into one of the other dishes. And there's some interesting work going on there now, looking at drone flight. Which I've always been interested in. And I said in an article some years ago, wouldn't it be good now that they've got the radar to look at drone flight and queen flight? And there's a project going on at the moment. It may well be the last project on bees at Rothamsted, which is hard to believe. So when I retired in 92, I was in the same position as you with extracting honey. And I had to extract honey we had the biggest crop ever in 1993, and we had to extract that in our little conservatory. And the Queen visited Rothamsted in that year, 93, the year after I retired. She probably heard. And my grandson made this flag the night before, and the Queen came over to him and said, "Oh, that's nice. Did you make that?" "Yes," he said. And she said, "Oh, that's really nice." But my granddaughter, I don't know whether you can see that, appears not to be too happy about it. She looks as though she's putting her fingers down her throat. The Queen became patron. And Varroa, I really haven't got enough time to talk too much about Varroa, but of course that was a big challenge. And I went back to Rothamsted for a time helping Brenda Ball look at samples and things. There's 3 there, I bet you can't spot them. Or can you? There's one on the side here somewhere. There's one there, look. The other 2 at the top. Okay. Right, and I went back for a time as a consultant in Sentinel, the sniffer bee people, which was a really interesting project. It was a private firm, but they came to Rothamsted because of their expertise in proboscis extension reflex and their history of flight rooms, using flight rooms for bees. And that was good fun, but that all folded up, even though it was very popular among a lot of people and very successful. And this was much how Rothamsted was when I joined. The main building there, the building on the right there is where I had my interview. And at the back were all these allotments which John Laws donated to the people of Harpenden. Allotments, probably about twice as many as you can see there. And this was Rothamsted last year. Much changed. But I have to say that although, there are a lot of these buildings and a lot of new buildings, Not many of these buildings contain working scientists. For example, this is a new conference centre. There's a lecture hall there. This is a canteen. This building, which used to be the entomology building, is now private. This is a science hub. I've no idea what goes on in there. This is the main building now, which contains scientists. There are very few scientists in this block, which used to be full. This white building here is on the site of the first home apiary. And there is a remnant of that here. This hedge, this hawthorn hedge, was there when it was there in 1922, 23. That's the last remnant. So there you go. That's Rothamsted. The last slide. In 2012, Rothamsted celebrated 90 years of bee research. So we held a function on the day organised by Juliet Osborne here, and they named this new field station after me. Now, I don't know why. I have no idea why, because I mean, the rest of the buildings, I mean, obviously it's a lot smaller, but the rest of the buildings are all named after directors, and most of them are dead. So I don't know. I was really, this was a setup. You know, Juliet arranged this with the director, and I knew nothing about it until about a week before it happened. But there we are. I'm quite thankful. I'm quite pleased. It's quite flattering, but there we go. So here's my other favourite scientist, Professor Juliet Osborne, and she's presented me with a photograph of my other favourite scientist, Tom Seeley, signing his book for me. I would like to obviously thank, quite a few of these photographs are from Rothamsted. This photograph was taken by Andrew Martin. The one of the comet was John Holderness, who's a Lincolnshire beekeeper. And I would like to thank my daughter-in-law for making this presentation for me. Thanks very much.
Oh, Peter, it's about the advertisement. One of the things, E.W. Taylor. I've got a beehive and WBCs that was given to me with a little disc on. E.W. Taylor. Do you know anything about that company?
What's it got on it?
E.W. Taylor.
E.H. Taylor?
Yeah, E.H., yeah.
E.H. Taylor, Welling, yeah. Yeah, we used to get all our stuff from there. It's only 25 minutes away from Rothamsted. We used to get all our stuff. And dare I say, Queens. Not all our Queens.
It was just the fact the disc on it. I just wondered what sort of age that.
Yeah, E.H. Taylor, big firm. Yeah. Oh, yeah, it was a massive firm. Yeah, Thorns took them over. They went bust. It happened overnight, virtually. I went on the...
1986, I went.
1986,
1986,
yeah. I was at the Shrewsbury Flower Show, and Thorns were there, and they said, "Oh no, we've taken over from Taylor's." I said, "Why?" They said, "Taylor's have gone bust." So on the Monday, I came straight back and went over to Taylor's to find out what was going on, and their representatives, salesmen, that were turning up, expecting to pick up stuff, and Thorns were there loading all the stuff on their lorries.
So those beehives are at least, 30 years old I've got there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, 1996 was
1996,
when...
yeah.
You said you went to night class and made your first beehive, and you took your wife with you. Has she still got the ironing board?
There's a sad story there, but I'm not going to tell you.
One of the back...
I'm just really wondering whether over the years you have actually decided on which type of hive is probably the best for maybe a novice or new beekeeper.
It's the same as there are no best ways in beekeeping. There are no best hives in beekeeping, only different ones. I've experienced practically every hive going. And no, it's what suits you. Can I tell you, have I got time to tell you the reason I went over to Smith's?
Yeah, go on, go on.
Okay. Ron Ribbons, who I told you died after he left Rothamsted, was killed in a road accident. He had Smith hives. And when he died, his widow, as I said, he was very friendly with Norman Element. His widow asked Norman Element to clear his stuff. And Norman found that he'd got more Smith hives than Norman had got standard hives. So Norman went over to Smith hives. Now, Norman was a brilliant carpenter, and he increased his numbers and made a lot of Smith hives. And then the same thing happened. Well, Norman didn't get killed, but Norman retired and started cutting down on his bees and started giving me Smith stuff. And because I finished up with more Smith stuff than I got of anything else. And Dayton hives are very easy to convert to Smiths. So that's what I did. And they're good. I mean, people think they're a smaller hive, but they're not. They're the same size internally. They've just got short lugs. But they're 1.5 inches smaller because of the short lugs. They're 1.5 inches narrower. So in those days, I had like a minivans. I had 2 or 3 minivans. It made a lot of difference to getting, them in a minivan. I could get, I could 4 on top and 8 inside. Take the passenger seat and then 2 there.
Peter, I think you said somewhere that you don't believe that the drones do form pre-assembly areas, which queens then find. I think you have said that drones come towards hives and the queens find them much more locally. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, it's not that I'm very indifferent, shall we say, about congregation areas, and the people seem to be so confident and sure that there are such places. There are obviously places where drones congregate. Butler said that, or believed, that when a drone detected a queen, it would come back to that spot. If it was unlucky, or lucky, it would come back to that same spot, probably till the end of its life. Now, my worry is that of people actually creating drone congregation areas by flying a lure. Because if they do that, and they get a sniff of what they think is a queen, and they're going to come back, and maybe when there's a few of them, they attract other drones, I'm not saying there are no such places, and it's quite possible then that may occur. But I think what is significant is where the queens go, and I think they've been looking at that at Rothamsted, but they didn't get a lot of success this year for some reason or other. But it would be interesting to see that, because queens go out a couple of times or more before they mate, and drones, they're out there. Drones are out there cruising. I can get drones. I got drones. After this sort of kicked off again, I went out with a lure and I got drones anywhere. Not huge numbers, but I got drones anywhere in Hertfordshire, my area of Hertfordshire, where I flew a lure. Sometimes it was only, very few. I even got drones out the back of my house, where I moved to, a small house. Out the back of the house, it's quite a small garden. There is a quadrangle surrounded by garages. And I fixed, a cane onto my shed, which was just a few yards from my back upstairs window, and I took photographs, and I got drones coming there. So, they're out there. They're cruising around out there all the time, like workers are. I never had bees in my garden, but whenever I came back to my house after I'd either got something, bee in the back, or I'd been doing beekeeping, within 2 minutes of being back, there would be a worker bee coming. But you couldn't see them, do you? But they are cruising all the time, and I think the drones are cruising all the time.
Yeah. Angus.
But it's just an opinion, though.
Background is agriculture, and Rothamsted, lots of new varieties coming out of Rothamsted and experiments on different crops, particularly horticultural. Have you got time to say anything about pollination? Did you get involved with the pollination at all?
In what respect?
The using the bees for. Were you moving around your beehives for different experiments on pollination?
John Free was doing that. John Free was the big noise in pollination. Yeah, he established, the numbers required for a given area of fruit. He did an awful lot of that, yeah. I mean, it's like, I can't remember the exact measurement now, but it's like put 2 colonies together, but, spaced out. And he worked out how many you should have per hectare, acre, whatever it was. Yeah, I can't remember how big an area it was, actually. But, yeah, he did an awful lot. As I say, he established, that regime of pollination work.
Is that still going on?
No, everything's coming to an end. This year, I'm really saddened by it because it's 95 years that bee research has been going on there. And the funding for the ecology division, because the department, there used to be about 12 different departments, entomology, biology, you name it. But it gradually cut down to divisions, and there was an ecology division, and the ecology division is going. That's with the loss of 50 posts. And within that ecology division is the bee section. Yeah. There was an upsurge when Juliet came. Juliet got things going again. I mean, at one time in the late 80s, late 80s, I was the only person working full-time on bees. It went steeply down. And then when Juliet came, it picked up, and with the radar, you know, she got the radar going there, and things picked up again until there were about maybe 10 or 11, not all necessarily permanent jobs, but 10 or 11. I mean, that's the trouble today, you know, there are no permanent jobs like in that picture 1956. All those were permanent people, you know, like me. They were there for donkey's years, and so you've got continuity. You've lost continuity. Yeah. It's rather sad. And can you understand it in the present situation? I mean, they were nowhere near the problems. All right, we had problems with spraying, really severe problems with spraying in the 70s, but nothing like the problems that we've got or are coming now. And Brenda Ball lost her job because of lack of funding. And I mean, she was a world authority on varroa and viruses. It's crazy, but there we are.
Did you want to read that?
Yeah, can I read this? I forgot to read this because it's really interesting. This is, you know, I showed you the 1936 conference with Tar Morris and Morgan Tyler, and Brother Adam was there too. And this is Brother Adam. This was stuff some pieces that were added after the conference. And Brother Adam said there is a form of paralysis that is quite distinct from the one first mentioned, which at times causes serious depletion in the strength of colonies. The symptoms of this malady resemble acarine disease in that the affected bees are deprived of the use of their wings. Bees suffering from this kind of paralysis appear to be normal in every respect, except that their wings are paralysed and often also dislocated. The disabled bees, mostly young ones, leave and run away from their home and eventually die of exhaustion. They do not form clusters on the ground, as in the case of acarine. The malady comes on suddenly. He goes on to say, this form of paralysis is no doubt identical to the disappearing disease that at one time caused such serious losses to many apiarists in the USA. Well, since 1936. And Rothamsted's Tar responded with this: it is by no means certain that bee paralysis is a single disease, and as can be seen from Brother Adam's remarks, there is some confusion as to exactly what is implied by this term. He goes on, it may transpire that there are several virus diseases of the adult bee which differ slightly from one another, or that there is a single disease modified by the presence of various bacteria. I mean, how prophetic was that? You know, 1936. Quite amazing, wasn't it?
Okay,
Yeah.
that's it. Yeah, we'll take one more then, yeah?
Oh,
I'm thinking of buying a queen bee.
yes?
Is there any way, in your experience, you can tell when you get the queen bee, before you put it in the hive, that it has been fully inseminated?
Not that I know of, no. Not that I know
So
of.
you cannot tell?
No, no.
You've heard a real gem of a lecture. Thank you very much, Peter Tomkins, for delivering.